Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Today on the Philosophy Salon, we've got an exciting show for you. We have our first speaker, in fact, Patrick Dwyer, psychology MA student at UC Davis, I believe. And he's going to be joining Ryan and I to talk about autism, which is one of his areas of research speciality. And we are going to explore autism, what autism is, and try to get to the some philosophical understanding of autism, in addition to learning some interesting things about autism from more of a psychological and a developmental perspective. So maybe without further ado, I'll just hand it over to you, Patrick, and you can say some introductory remarks about yourself and what your interests are.
For sure. Yeah, thank you for inviting me here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So as you said, I'm Patrick, he, him. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis, and I am autistic myself, as well as doing autism research. So that's something that's probably important to bear in mind about me. It does affect my perspective. I'm actually part of a growing community of autism researchers, something that I'm really glad to see for the field. And actually, I co-chair the Autistic Researchers Committee at INSAR, the International Society for Autism Research. My own research is primarily focused on sensory processing and sensory experiences in autism, and how those might be related to attention and other things about them, variability in sensory experiences. There's a lot to unpack there because there's all these sensory experiences that are atypical in autistic people that, you know, often just aren't understood by neurotypical society, and unfortunately in many cases can be causing pretty severe distress to autistic people. But I have wide interests beyond that, some of which get more into philosophy related territory. So for example, I'm quite interested in the neurodiversity movement, the politics of autism, and there's a lot of great philosophical work that's being done in that area by people like Robert Chapman, for example, who's a philosopher in the UK. I'm also interested in some of the ontology of autism, and there's also a lot of issues around autism terminology and things. I have broad interests, which hopefully will give us plenty to talk about.
Oh, glad to hear that. I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about, indeed. So maybe on that note, just to begin, we can perhaps maybe arrive at some understanding of what autism is exactly, and just the nuts and bolts of it. So question maybe that I'd like to put forward at this stage, and I know, correct me on my phraseology, by the way, I know you're mindful of the language that you use to describe autism and autistic individuals. So feel free to use the words that work for you, and also just take note too that the language that I do use is not meant to be derogatory in any way. It's just the terminology that I use, and I don't necessarily think it has
I
any
totally understand.
connotation.
Don't worry. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and if it turns out to be relevant, we can just explore it. So yeah, okay. Don't worry.
Sounds good. Well, on that note then, I just wanted to ask the question then, what are the defining symptoms of autism? And we might even just want to rephrase that. If we don't want to use the word symptoms, use whatever word that works for you, I suppose. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, I probably would prefer a word like behaviors or characteristics, something that's, a bit more sort of neutrally descriptive, not trying to assign value judgments to things. And in terms of what they are, there's been some disagreement about this historically. Currently, according to the almighty Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which apparently nobody is permitted to disagree with in certain circles. There are two major domains: social communication differences in autism, described as deficits, and restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior and interest. And I am not one of those people who refuses to criticize the DSM. I have, there's some issues there in that publication, and I definitely don't think that it's definitive as to what exactly is going on. I would first of all take a step back and ask the question, well, what is autism anyway? Is it a thing? Is it a social construct? I would come down on the side of it's a social construct. It's an entity that we invented to talk about a group of people with some behaviors that we find to be sort of kind of similar, but an incredibly diverse group of people in every possible respect. And there are certain behaviors that we have defined autism as in the DSM, but I wouldn't necessarily describe them in the same way that the DSM does. I would say that there's definitely some social communication differences. I wouldn't necessarily say they're deficits. There's interesting research, for example, suggesting that a lot of autistic people, particularly autistic people without intellectual disabilities, I guess, can find it actually perfectly fine to communicate socially with other autistic people or in particular contexts. It's actually only when you throw autistic people together with neurotypical people that you can sometimes see communication gaps. There was this fascinating study where information transmission was just as good with autistic people only and with neurotypical people only, but once you throw autistic and neurotypical people together, totally broke down. So social communication differences can be disabilities, but not deficits, which is an important distinction that I'd be happy to say more about later. And then as for the restricted repetitive behaviors, etc., that's kind of actually just starting to be seen, I think, as a catch-all domain for everything that's not social or communication. Work, for example, by Rachel Grove, I think it was recently, is suggesting that actually there's multiple independent, quite different things in that domain. So, for example, stimming behaviors. For example, I am right now flapping my arm. You can't necessarily see me, but you can know for a fact that I am flapping my arm as a demonstration of a kind of stimming behavior. And that's very distinct from some of the sensory processing differences that I mentioned before, like the sensory distress or also intense pleasurable sensory interests. There's a lot of autistic people, for example, who are very into music for that reason. So those are just a couple of examples of two quite different things that kind of get lumped in there.
Right. Well, that was very densely packed, but very informative nonetheless. I thought you touched upon some interesting ideas there. And the one that stuck home with me, especially, was this idea of autism being a social construct. And, I can kind of sympathize with that view to a degree. I mean, I think too, what you say there can maybe even be generalized to a lot of the different disorders in the DSM. To neatly, it almost seems like in some senses, I find the DSM kind of tries to neatly pigeonhole people into certain categories. But my own view of human beings is we're vast and complex and often contradictory beings, and we have all these different idiosyncrasies and nuances to us, and from everything from the design of our brains to our personalities. And so I'd be happy to go into that maybe a little bit more, this idea of autism being a social construct. I think, like, my own view, when I try to make sense of that from a philosophical perspective, I kind of think of how we will formulate constructs because they're useful explanatory fictions, right? We often do that to for predictive purposes. We're trying to predict behavior. We're trying to maybe make generalizing about people easier, so we assign people certain attributes that kind of apply across populations and so on. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a kind of an ontological status, as it were, right? I mean, they're just simply tools, maybe to a degree. So I'd be curious to hear what either of you, where you guys weigh in on that.
Should I give you a chance to speak?
Honestly, Graham kind of covered what my questions there. It was largely based on the ontology of autism. It's not something that I've had a whole lot of time to think about. I know I have my own beefs with the DSM as well. I find like a lot of these things that are labeled as disorders or illnesses or whatever, they are simply constructs. I guess maybe for me, my question to you would be more, do you find these labels useful? You know, like they are, whether they are social constructs or not, do you find them pragmatic and in a good,
I think they can be. For sure. I mean, I am very comfortable in the identity of an autistic person. Like, it was the very first thing practically that I mentioned when I was introducing myself. I'm Patrick and I'm autistic, basically. And there's a reason for that. It is useful. It links me to a community of people who are not exactly like me. I mean, autism, like I said, is super diverse, probably more diverse than the neurotypical population in many respects. But at the same time, there's some common experiences that we do have there. A common experience, certainly, of being different from neurotypical society, even if we aren't always necessarily super similar to each other. So that community, that identity is one thing. There's also a lot of practical value in terms of how we organize things in our society. We need some kind of system for allocating, who is going to get supports and accommodations and things like that. And every now and then you will see proposals put in place that, from now on, we're just going to do some sort of universal design type thing. We're just going to try and make the world accessible and inclusive of everybody, absolutely and completely. And we're going to try and get rid of some of these labels. And usually there's a lot of pushback from the disability community when anybody ever says that, because people are like, well, no, we are disabled and we are facing all of these additional challenges and barriers. And it's these labels that allow us to receive supports for that. If you just create, a general sort of, accessibility for all type system, then the people who are going to benefit from that are the people who don't actually need it. There's also other things too, like the fact that autistic people have come together and formed a community has meant that autistic people can actually start to contest some of these ideas, including the ones in the DSM that we might not particularly like, and to start to propose alternative understandings to develop autistic ideas about autism. There's a lot of ideas about autism that until recently you would never have seen in any sort of research or clinical work, but that are now belatedly starting to be recognized by people in those areas who are realizing that, oh yes, autistic people were onto something when they started talking about their own experiences and drawing attention to these issues that we were not aware of from our perspective as neurotypical people looking from the outside.
Yeah, well, that's a lot to digest there. I mean, I definitely would agree with a lot of what you said there. I think this idea of the language we use as being, having this instrumental value to it, I think is valid. And, I think as conceptual tools, categories can be useful, for the purposes that you've just gone over. One thing that kind of that brought to mind was how in lots of philosophers have this tendency to view their philosophical vocation as in some sense, revising our concepts, updating our concepts. And you see that you get a lot of this in philosophy. Philosophers, especially like if you look at analytical philosophy, they're always analyzing the meanings of terms and the logical conditions of certain statements, and even the pragmatics of certain concepts and certain statements and the language we use. And I come up from somewhat of a pragmatist perspective on all of this, and in some sense, I kind of feel like all knowledge to some extent is instrumental, but that's not to say that we can't have an objective reality. It's just to say that the words we use have particular uses, and this, along with the technologies we develop and everything like along those lines, and I think it's always in a state of flux, and so we're always continually revising our concepts and revising our categories. And I think a good metaphor for this is there's a philosopher named Otto Neurath, and he had this metaphor of knowledge kind of being like this raft on the water, and we're constantly trying to replace the planks on the raft, and the planks kind of represent knowledge. So we're kind of continually discarding the pieces of the raft and replacing them with new ones, but we're always on this same raft, but it's a raft that stays the same, but it's always changing in that manner. And that's how I kind of reflect on how knowledge evolves and how knowledge develops.
Yeah, it sounds kind of in a way almost like a bit of paradigm shift. Maybe I'm very Kuhnian myself, very much in sort of a Kuhnian post-positivist / social constructivist area in terms of my own views on this. And I think, yeah, that's exactly what a lot of people are trying to do. There's actually some interesting work on this. I forget who wrote it, but there was recently a paper from a philosophical perspective, I'm pretty sure, talking about justice or hermeneutic injustice or something like that in the autism world, and how the way that we talk about autism was developed by a lot of people who are not autistic, and indeed the way we talk about things in general was developed by a lot of people who are not autistic, but how creating these communities of people who are autistic, who are neurodivergent, has allowed us to develop a lot of concepts and ideas for expressing experiences that would not have been possible to express prior to that the language to describe them, to articulate them, to conceptualize them just did not exist. There's also some similar work by Ben Belloc, who's I think in anthropology, also documenting some of the concepts and ideas coming out of the autistic community, and really how those allow people to give voice to things that otherwise would just not have been able to have been easy to talk about.
That's pretty fascinating how everyone's kind of contributed to the evolution of the understanding of autism and how we talk about it.
Yeah, and it's always, actively an ongoing conversation, and really understood differently in different communities. Like, I'm autistic, I'm an autism researcher. I can be in a meeting with a bunch of very biomedically oriented, very sort of traditional, more on the positivist side, perhaps, of post-positivism than I would be, type people in the morning, and then in the afternoon I might be chatting with a bunch of autistic people, and it's just totally different understandings of autism, completely different vocabularies, completely different sets of concepts, just really quite different there. So there's a lot of different communities in the autism world. And each of these different communities seems to have its own way of conceptualizing things, its own concepts, its own vocabulary, its own distinct sorts of trigger issues, where one always sees controversy when people from, two different communities run into each other and just find that there's some mismatch in their beliefs that they can't easily resolve, where the concepts and beliefs associated with one community just really are incompatible with those in the other community, and without really a deep understanding of where the other community is coming from, it can be very difficult to bridge over some of those divides.
Right. I think that's an interesting point you bring up there. It almost kind of reminds me of this idea of there, you know, both groups of researchers, the more traditional medical model and the more, I don't know what term you would use to describe, you know, the group of researchers that represent your views, but it seems to be like two incommensurable paradigms kind of, you know, coming together here, and different vocabularies, different lexicons, different conceptual frameworks, and you know, I wonder if there's any way of bridging this divide between the paradigms, and whether there can be a meeting of minds and a bringing together maybe of the ideas from both sides of the camp.
Yeah, you're very much asking the same sorts of questions I like to ask. So recently, for example, I was invited to comment on a paper about autism terminology. And it was written by some folks who aren't necessarily coming from a medical model perspective. I think they're coming from the perspective of sort of this person-centered language community, which is very strong, for example, in the intellectual disability self-advocacy movement and those allied to them, among other groups. So these researchers who are very interested in person-centered language, they were concerned about people, for example, going around and saying autistic person. They think everybody should probably say person with autism, and they thought that if people were saying autistic person, that this would tend to result in stigma. And so they did this study, and they were looking at all of the different papers that had been published on autism in a few different journals over a certain period of time, and they were looking at, you know, autistic person and person with autism, and then seeing what other language they considered stigmatizing was there. But the thing is, they were including some terms like disabled in their view of what constitutes stigmatizing language that reflect a particular perspective on disability. A perspective that disability is like a bad thing rooted in the person, which I guess actually is the medical model of disability, come to think of it. So I retract that. I guess they were in the medical model perspective. And, you know, a lot of people just don't agree with that perspective on what disability is. They think of it as something that is caused by society's failure to accommodate and include, or and this is my own personal view, that there's a mismatch between the person and the environment, that the environment is just not geared towards that particular person. And so it could mean that teaching the person some useful coping skills will, you know, address that issue, but more likely there's going to be a need on the part of society to shift. So getting back to this paper, there's some circularity here. These people are so enmeshed in their own sort of paradigm that they're having some difficulty seeing beyond it. They're starting to see some circularity in their views. And so when I was responding to this paper, I was talking about exactly this, that, yeah, I think what we're seeing here is some incommensurability, that these different communities have such different understandings of the language, such different ways of operationalizing concepts, that it's just really hard for people to step out of that place that they're in and to see things from the other perspective. And so even when people are actually trying, they end up just sort of reinforcing their own existing opinions and realizing that, oh yeah, the other people are saying things that are bad under my paradigm. And so yeah, they really were wrong and my paradigm was right. But I did ask this a second and more important question as well that you're mentioning, you know, what do we do about it? And I think that really the answer there has to be engagement. We need to sit down and have conversations like this one that we're having here, where we can really start to explore a lot of the different understandings. I try not to be bound up in any one paradigm. I have my opinions. I try to be able to at least understand, though, the opinions of people who disagree with me. And I think it's very much our responsibility to do that, especially when we're in positions of power. So as researchers, for example, I think there's a clear obligation there to engage with other viewpoints and to understand them and to respect what people in the community want. So as a researcher, I have that obligation. As an autistic person, that's not the burden that's on me, that's the burden that's on the researcher. So yes, I think that it's very important that we have this sort of engagement. And I also think it's important that we make sure that the burden of starting that engagement is on the people that it needs to be.
Points well put. Yeah, I think you've raised a lot of interesting points there. Do you have anything you want to contribute there, Ryan? Or
I just think that we're kind of going onto the next question here, like, or at least we're skirting around it, which is like this idea of terminology and the idea of ontology between different terms used within the community. So I know, Patrick, that you had brought up the politics surrounding the use of the word Asperger's syndrome. So I was wondering, what are the differences between autism spectrum disorder and Asperger's disorder as it's traditionally conceived, and what is the conversation going on surrounding those terms?
Yeah. So this goes back decades and decades, if you want the long answer. I'll try and keep this as brief as possible, but like I was saying, our autism is kind of a construct. So the boundaries of it, what we think of it as, they've kind of shifted over the years. And so it used to be, when autism was first invented, that we're talking about a very small group of people. There's just not so much awareness of neurodivergence back then. And to the extent that people were identified as neurodivergent, that would often result in institutionalization, as people being sent off and detained, even as children, in these absolutely horrible facilities, like, for example, the infamous Willowbrook school. They called it a school, but I mean, we're talking about a place that makes prisons look good by comparison. And this was something that ended up resulting in a very narrow definition of autism, that only the most obviously extremely neurodivergent people would have been diagnosed with autism, because unfortunately there is a great deal of discrimination and prejudice against those people that as still remains very much intact today. So they were the most vulnerable to this. But after institutionalization ended, the autism constellation started to broaden up. You started to see more people being identified. There actually being some supports and resources that would be useful, so that you could start to diagnose people. And so people were casting around for a category here. There was also research that was being done. People were starting to realize that twins were likely to be sort of concordant for autism, but maybe not to the same degree. Maybe one twin would be very obviously autistic, and maybe the other twin would be somewhat less obviously autistic. And so for all these reasons, people realized that they needed a new category to include the so-called mild cases, I guess, not that I would phrase it that way myself. And so that's where Asperger's came from, which was a term that was sort of resurrected from an entity that was invented by this psychiatrist around World War II era in Austria. And interestingly, that was not the only time that something like Asperger's was invented. I could point to a few other examples, but I think because of the institutionalization, as I said, it just wasn't the right time for the idea. So whoever invented it, it always went away after. But its idea had come, and so they added it in again. But they started to realize that there wasn't really a clear boundary between Asperger's and autism. It was very difficult to tell people apart. And so from a clinician perspective, it just didn't prove to be that useful an entity. I could share, for example, from my own experience being diagnosed. I was diagnosed under the previous DSM back when Asperger's was still around. And I probably should have gone the Asperger's label just based on how it was defined back then. But it benefited the school that I was attending for me to get a different label of high functioning autism, which is a term that people in the community absolutely hate. So they diagnosed me with that so that the school could get some extra funding, which never benefited me in any way. But that just is one of the many ways in which, from a clinical point of view, the diagnostic system wasn't working. It also wasn't working from the perspective of autistic advocates. Interestingly, there's been this sort of tension throughout the autistic advocacy movement, led by autistic people, I mean, that advocacy movement, between people who are sort of like, they're called Aspie supremacists, people who are like, oh yes, the most able autistic people are really just as good as, if not better than, neurotypicals, and are just struggling because of discrimination. And if that discrimination is eliminated, then everybody's fine. And so our goal should be to eliminate that discrimination and allow Asperger's people to take their natural place as part of / potentially leading society. I'm slightly exaggerating because I'm not one of those people. So that was maybe a bit of a straw man mischaracterization, I must admit. But basically, that's the idea. And then there's also this other group of people who are saying, no, absolutely not. There's common interest between all autistic people. All autistic people are disabled. We all face these barriers and challenges to varying degrees. And a lot of what the neurodiversity movement wants is important for even the people who encounter the most barriers and challenges. And so we need to have solidarity and act as a collective here. And we need to work against the logic of disability itself, rather than implicitly accepting the idea that disabled people should be marginalized and oppressed and discriminated against and should experience all these sorts of challenges. By arguing that we're not disabled, we should embrace the fact that we're disabled and aim for a much more revolutionary change, trying to make disability itself. And then to make things even more complicated, it turned out that Asperger was maybe possibly involved in the Nazi attempt to exterminate disabled people. There's still debate about the extent of that, and I don't want to weigh on on that right now, but there's some people who think that should be a major part of the debate, although personally I feel like our identities today should not be dictated by the actions of one dead person 80 years ago, whether or not he was involved in genocide. So that is Asperger's, the semi-long, as short as I can make it, given my autistic tendency to get intensely interested in things. And
that's all right. It livens up the conversation, and I appreciate all of your insights with regards to that. I mean, I've done some brief research on the difference myself, just to kind of get a handle on it, and basically sort of summarize what my own understanding was of it and added on to it. The gist of what I gather from the distinction in some senses is, you know, on the one hand, you know, you have a higher functioning type of individual who we say has Asperger's.
Higher functioning, by the way, is not a term that people in the community like, but yeah, that's the essence of it.
Yes, and then someone farther down on this spectrum maybe has some more of those, you know, so-called impairments and deficits in, you know, social communication and repetitive behaviors and rigidity and so on and so forth. And I mean, you know, you could neatly draw that distinction, I suppose, where you could say it's all on a continuum and it's just a difference of degree and not kind in terms of disorder, or however you want to describe it. I mean, you know, ultimately, I think, again, it's just whichever way you want to talk about it, it's a conceptual tool, I think. You know, maybe some ways of talking about it are more useful than other ways of talking about it are. Maybe some ways of talking about it are more inclusive than some ways of talking about it are. Maybe some ways of talking about it are, more convey more of a sense of compassion than other ways are. So I think it really just depends on the concepts and the language you're using to describe the phenomena. This one issue you've brought up a few times, I find to be pretty interesting as well, which I wanted to just briefly touch on. It's just this definition of disability as this mismatch between person and the environment. I like that definition. I mean, I can even sympathize with it personally to some degrees. I mean, I feel like I've been in certain situations before where I felt like, the reason why, say academically, for example, this reason why I wasn't performing to say my potential was because not so much because of inherent deficiencies or defects, but it was because the environment wasn't aligning with maybe my current developmental trajectory. And maybe my current developmental trajectory was completely fine. It was evolving in its own way, in its own time, kind of organically. And then I sit in a class to write a test, and maybe I don't do so well because I had other things going on within my development. Whereas if I were to kind of approach it on my own terms, if I was able to kind of control the conditions, and things might be slightly different in that respect. And I guess that can kind of maybe generalize to other areas of life as well. But I think that's an interesting way of conceptualizing a disability, rather than as being something that kind of that's pejorative, that kind of points to some kind of moral failure or personal weakness or something along those lines.
Yeah. This is really the politics of the disability world and disability studies. What is disability? And that's a question that has been intensely debated with a great deal of confusion back and forth. I've actually done some research on this because I said that I like this perspective that it is this sort of mismatch, and I'm glad you agree with that. There's another perspective out there that says that it is society's, that it's society's failure to include people to be accessible that is disabling people. That's the social model of disability is what it's called. And sort of the classic example of this, because it came out of the physical disability world, would be somebody with a physical disability who needs an accessible ramp, say to get down and cross the street or to get up into a building or whatever, and that's not provided. Well, then they are disabled by society's failure to provide that ramp. But it does kind of break down a little when you take it to extremes, because there are some cases where you can see that individual characteristics are sort of relevant and contributing to disability, or where it'd be very difficult to imagine how reforming society would eliminate disability. There's this one article that sort of reduces the argument to the absurd and says, well, if we don't think that the individual characteristics are at all relevant, if it's all society, then why do we go to effort to prevent car crashes that disable people? If it's all society's fault, then that should be morally neutral, right? If we just go around breaking people's legs and stuff, or severing their spinal cords. So yeah, that has led to a lot of controversy. But the interesting thing is, people who say that they accept the social model of disability in this study that we did, that's not yet published, what we found is that people who say that are still very much in favor of doing some practical sorts of interventions to teach people useful skills that will help them function in the world. So yes, they want to reform society, but they're not opposed to the idea that yes, sometimes you need to work with the individual and focus on the individual. It's not something they were as enthusiastic about as reforming society, and nor should we be. I mean, we already do so much to try and force people to conform to society and sort of hide who they are and try and cope and camouflage and mask themselves and pretend to be neurotypical and abled in order to get by. So, of course, we're not enthusiastic about asking people to do more than that, but sometimes people were saying it's necessary. So there's this mismatch where people are using the rhetoric of the social model of disability, which has led to no end of controversy because people outside the social model of disability really push back on this idea. But when you actually look at what these autism stakeholders, autistic people, parents of autistic people, some autistic parents, some non-autistic parents, etc., what all these autism stakeholders were saying who supported the social model, it looked as though their views were a lot more nuanced than the opponents that were criticizing them were making out to be. So this is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why autism politics are so intensely controversial. There's, again, getting back to a point you were making earlier, a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of incommensurability, people using terms and not really understanding how other people are using them, and that leading to a lot of people talking past each other and arguing past each other.
Right. Yeah, I know. I think you put forward a lot of valid points there, and I think that you know what's needed is to maybe to better facilitate communication between these different theoretical people from different theoretical schools. Is this maybe just a willingness to listen and to you know, be able to fully grasp the meanings of what one group is trying to say and convey to that group's satisfaction, and then vice versa, right? And so I think
Yes.
maybe progress can be made on that front.
I hope so. I hope so.
This is a fascinating rabbit hole we could go down pretty far into. I wanted, though, to maybe transition to maybe going from the social to the causal, because I'm also interested in etiology and what are the exact factors that are at play in the development of autism, ASD, or whatever way we want to describe it. I think I'm thinking more or less biopsychosocial in this respect. What are some of the biological factors and the psychological factors and the social factors? You know, based on my own understandings, from what I gather, a lot of factors are biological in nature. Genetic influence, heritability,
yes,
and also an interplay though with the environment.
Yes,
you know, as well. So it's it goes both ways. And,
indeed it does.
And I know there's also the social dimension too. I know that certain things like extreme social deprivation can often has been correlated with autistic behaviors and so on and so forth. So maybe I'll just pass it on to you and feel free to address any of that in any way you'd like. So.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's a complex mixture of these things. There's actually, I mentioned this earlier, research showing with twins, identical twins, even, that you can often see that it's more likely that you will see both twins are autistic, so very genetic, but interestingly, not in the same way. Like you can see one twin is much more obviously autistic than the other twin. I've actually seen this once or twice, and it is really disconcerting in a way to see these visibly identical people, and yet one of them in their behavior, you know, clearly seems to be much more obviously outwardly autistic. Whatever's going on internally in their head, it's much more obvious externally. And that is just, you know, a phenomenon that points to some of the complexity here. That, yeah, there's genetic factors. Some of that is related to specific genetic variants. They're usually also very heavily related to intellectual disability or other sorts of co-occurring conditions. But then you've also got this sort of polygenetic, you know, I don't know what the right word for it is, a mess maybe, a polygenetic mess where you've just got a ton of different things all interacting with each other and with the environment. And sometimes that results in autism, and sometimes that does not. And that's what we would tend to call idiopathic autism, where there's not necessarily like a clear single genetic cause. But even when there is a clear single genetic cause, it's not deterministic. So for example, Fragile X syndrome is one example of a specific genetic variant that's very heavily related to autism, as well as various other diagnoses, including intellectual disability and anxiety. And Fragile X syndrome often ends in autism, but not always. And that's very common, that even where there is like a specific single genetic cause, it doesn't lead to autism all the time. So then that leads to the question of what sorts of environmental factors are involved. And that's, I think, a very tricky field. It's a very tricky field because there's a temptation there to go and say, oh, well, we're going to do a study and we're going to go and see whether there is some factor in people's environments that's related to the likelihood that they develop autism after we control for everything else we can think of that might be related. But I can't remember if this paper might actually have been in the statistics class that we both took. Brian, does ice cream pool deaths mean anything to you?
Yes, it rings a bell, yes.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite papers because it explains so much. So the author of this paper, they were saying, well, let's imagine that we're trying to examine the relationship between ice cream consumption and the likelihood of drowning in the pool. And if we are using our good researcher hats, we realize that there's a confounding variable here, that when it's hot, people are probably going to drink ice cream and they're probably also going to go in the pool. So that could introduce a spurious relationship. So being good researchers, we measure the temperature and we control for it. But we measure temperature imperfectly. Instead of using the actual temperature, we just ask people, on a scale of like 1 to 5, how hot do you feel today? And that's not a perfect measure. So when we try and regress out the influence of that confounder, we fail to do so because it was imperfect. And so we still end up concluding that ice cream caused people to drown in the pool, which is just a failure of research methods. So I think that as far as specific environmental causes, we are still in our infancy there because frankly, sometimes it's hard to be sure that the researchers have thought of every single possible confounding variable or that they've measured them all correctly. So we know, I guess, that there's very little that I think we can be really confident about as far as specific environmental causes. I suspect that things in the prenatal environment are very heavily involved. There may be some autoimmune stuff in there. Ironically, for people who think that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine causes autism, pretty much the first environmental cause of autism that was actually pretty definitively proven is that maternal rubella causes autism. So get your MMR vaccines. If you don't want to be autistic or have your kids be autistic, get your MMR vaccine. So that's a big irony there for those who are anti-vaxxers. But yeah, and then you also mentioned this other question of social influences, and that's a fraught area. That's a fraught area because there is this history in the autism world of blaming parents, and specifically mothers, because people were sexist, blaming mothers for autism. This was the idea of the refrigerator mother, that the mother was cold and unfeeling and this caused autism. And there's a possibility there that maybe people were noticing autistic parents and blaming the autistic parents for their kids also being autistic, which is just genetic. It's also possible that this was a spurious effect because in the early days, autism tended to be diagnosed in people who were very high in socioeconomic status, who tended to be like achievement-oriented, I guess, because that's how they got to be of high socioeconomic status. So whatever was going on there, anyway, the idea was wrong. Autism is not caused by refrigerator mothers. or refrigerator fathers for that matter. Not that anybody was talking about refrigerator fathers. And that doesn't mean, though, that the social environment isn't relevant. And, one thing that people do talk a lot about today is how there might be some sorts of developmental cascades where things that are not inherently, the characteristics of autism develop as a result of an altered sort of developmental trajectory that affects what people's experiences end up being early in development. So it seems as though autistic people early in life, have sort of a different way of attending to things in the world very often. And very often autistic people end up sort of focused on particular things in their environment that are of interest to them. And that may mean, for example, that they are paying less attention to other people around them, paying less attention to other people who are trying to have social interactions with them, or direct their attention towards interesting things in the environment that they could learn from. And so it's thought that this lack of social attention, this lack of joint engagement with other people tends to result in some loss of opportunities to learn useful skills and development. And probably the autistic people who end up with the most skills and end up scoring highest on IQ tests probably are the autistic people who don't have so much of this as other autistic people. And so a lot of the questions and debates around early intervention sort of revolve around, is there an issue here, and what would be the best and most humane and least damaging way of trying to give people some of these early useful experiences without sort of trampling out their autism, unless you're one of those people who thinks that trampling out the autism is A, desirable, or B, possible. So there, that's my answer to that one. Sorry for going on so long, but it's a complex question that you asked.
Yeah, no, it was a complex question and it demanded a complex answer. And I think that's what we got. I think you touched on some interesting points there. Lots to dig into there. This one issue you brought up, especially with the environmental influences, kind of reminded me of this problem in epistemology of uncertainty and uncertainty of knowledge in that regard, as far as cause and effect goes. And it's difficult. It's difficult to pinpoint a distinct cause with regards to environment, or even any other cause for that matter. And so that kind of gets into issues of causality. And so yeah, I mean, I think we can come up with some good conjectures, some good hypotheses, and see which ones are the most predictive, and how can you ultimately tell? That's a question I wonder about.
It's a tricky question. You're right. I mean, I mentioned immune things, for example, but how can we look like 5 years after the fact, when you have a child who's autistic, or 10 years later, or however long later, and you look at the mother and you try and see if there's something in the mother's immune system that could be causing autism to develop. But by that time, it could very well be that raising an autistic child in a neurotypical world that is not fit for them is a stressful thing to do. And so that could affect the maternal immune system. So exactly as you say, that too is another issue there. You're quite right.
Interesting. Well, we could maybe transition to another point. Did you want to chime in, Ryan, or?
I did have one question that I remember being a topic of conversation when we were in school together, Patrick, more pertaining to the biological factors and the difference between males and females in terms of the presentation of autism and its diagnosis.
Yeah. That. What about that? There's a lot. Do you want me to just talk about that in general, or?
Yeah, I remember there being some sort of conjecture about it being perhaps underdiagnosed in women.
Yes.
And it just came to mind because when you were talking about mothers and just sort of the relationship between their child, and how they may very well have had autism themselves. So I'm just not sure if there's sort of like an update on some of this research over the past, what has it been, 6 years now, 5 years now, something like that. So I just wasn't sure if you had something to add in regards to that.
I do. I can add things in relation to that. So yes, you're right. You remembered correctly. Congratulations. That's actually a significant feat, given that it's 5 or 6 years later, as you say. So yeah, for autism as well as some other things like ADHD, these are stereotypically associated with boys and men, primarily boys. They're not really so well recognized in adulthood, unfortunately. And so people just aren't really geared to look for them in girls or women, which tends to result in very delayed diagnosis because it can look different in girls and women. Plus, people aren't even looking for it anyway. So if they aren't looking for it, they aren't going to notice it, whether it's the same or not. So for example, in autism, I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, that one of the sort of restricted and repetitive things that's not social communication is that we often have these very intense interests. I don't want to be too gender stereotypical here, but the intense interests do sometimes tend to vary on the basis of gender. So that, for example, in girls or women, you might tend to see more people who are interested in animals and fewer people who are interested in trains, although that is, again, very much a gender stereotype. And of course, there's going to be autistic people of all genders who have a variety of interests. There's also a lot of misdiagnosis. A lot of autistic girls and women end up being diagnosed with anxiety or depression or eating disorders or some combination thereof, or other things entirely. And that's usually true, but it may not be the underlying thing. It may be that this is somebody who is autistic and has had a lot of negative experiences and is not understood by others. And so that leads to some of these other things happening. And the underlying reason then is missed because people are satisfied with the more surface level diagnosis. So in terms of updates on the last 5 or 6 years, I would say that good news, people are much better about this in the research world among autism experts. Bad news, that knowledge is not penetrated to the community. There's still a huge issue with people in the community just not recognizing this, or even professionals going around and just doubting or denying the diagnoses that women and girls have, which is really, really awful, and is causing all sorts of unnecessary barriers, as well as people having to sort of doubt their identities and sort of have some imposter syndrome. So that's really unfortunate. The other thing that has really grown that people are now much more aware of, I think, than they were back when we were talking, is gender diversity in autism, going beyond that binary, because we're increasingly realizing that autistic people are much more likely to identify as non-binary or trans or something beyond the gender binary. There's even a term autigender for people who are autistic and do not identify with binary gender categories, but who do identify strongly with their autism and see their autism as their reason, I guess, or part of their reason for not identifying with binary gender categories. And there's interesting debates as to why this is. Maybe autistic people are just sort of less vulnerable to social influence, and that we're no more likely to be gender diverse than anybody else. It's just that the other people are in denial about it. Other people think that there maybe is something about what results in autism that makes people more likely to be gender diverse. I think the former is onto something. We can be a bit stubborn and less vulnerable to social influence. I don't know about the latter. There's a lot of research on gender and autism that has not been well done, and so I don't want to speculate there until there's stronger evidence.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you answered even more questions than I thought I had there, so that was great.
As I said, I am talkative. There's usually no problem getting me to talk. The problem is usually getting me to shut up.
Well, maybe on that note, could you please? No, just kidding. No, I think you brought up some good points there, and I'm always for broadening the discussion beyond the initial starting point, and I think that often can lead to some interesting discoveries that we hadn't anticipated in advance. So, I'm all for more of that, definitely. I thought I don't know if I have anything else there to add myself. Other than that, I find that to be pretty fascinating. All those things you brought up about gender and how that impacts, how autism manifests and how we perceive it in others, and all those other things as well. I guess you had brought up this issue too of anxiety and depression in autistic individuals, and I think that could maybe segue to the question that I had on comorbidities. From my understanding, from what I gather, is anxiety and depression and mood disorders are among some of the typical comorbidities that we see in autistic individuals. I think obsessive compulsive disorder usually gets thrown into the lump as well, and probably some others as well that aren't coming to mind. But yeah, maybe you could just offer your insights on that. I know
it's another huge question. Fair warning.
Yes, no, I know it's a huge question, and so feel like if you want to just break off sizable chunks and we can go from there, maybe to make it easier. From what I gather, a lot of these comorbidities are the result of certain aspects of neurobiology, I suppose, in autistic individuals, and enlarged amygdalas, for example, and maybe certain other regions are developed in certain ways that maybe predispose them to those disorders, and that's just considering the biological factors, of course, too. But that's
I mean, it's an interesting mixture of biology and experience, as it is with autism itself. As you were saying earlier, it's complicated because you wouldn't necessarily know that an enlarged amygdala is the result of some inherent biological property, as opposed to something about people's experience that results in a different sort of developmental trajectory for an amygdala, assuming somebody even has a large amygdala, because there's very considerable heterogeneity in autism, of course. But yeah, I think that there is the biology, and there are the experiences, and there's the complex interplay of them. And so, for example, you see a lot of people with ADHD, as well as being autistic, which is really interesting because people think of ADHD as being about an attention deficit and autism as being about a really intense hyperfocus, which might seem like opposites, but then when you think about it further, you actually realize that in ADHD, people do hyperfocus on things that are intrinsically engaging and interesting, whereas in autism, people do have their attention captured by aversive sensory stimuli and background noise and stuff like that. So actually they end up, despite ostensibly being opposites, actually looking a lot closer together than they might initially. And that's probably due to some basic underlying similarity in sort of the early etiology, including probably some neurobiological stuff, as you say. But then you've got things like the anxiety and the depression, which are probably, I think, primarily due to the fact that people, unfortunately, often have very negative experiences. They're often quite isolated, bullied, victimized. The neurotypical world is not understanding or accepting of autistic people by and large, particularly not of autistic children. That's just the sad reality of the world that we live in, and that takes a toll, on people day after day after day. There's, an intense pressure for people to hide themselves in who they are, particularly autistic girls and women who face more of that sort of social pressure that comes with being female. And that becomes exhausting, which further impacts mental health and anxiety. You see autistic burnout, which seems to be a sort of mental health thing that's distinct from depression and anxiety that's found in autism, but is super poorly researched, only just starting to research it. One of those autistic ideas I mentioned at the beginning, as is camouflaging and masking itself. That thing that I was saying was so exhausting, the hiding of who you are. So my point is that a lot of that is related to experience, getting back to my point. But then there's also this tendency in autism to sort of hyper-focus on things. And so if you're hyper-focusing maybe on some rumination, your attention is captured by some ruminations and then you hyper-focus on them. That could further exacerbate this. So you could probably see that then as being some combination of the negative experiences that autistic people have as a result of being in the neurotypical world and facing a lot of challenges, but also some inherent tendencies about autistic cognition that may lend themselves towards anxiety or depression. And then there's also other things too, like there's physical health co-occurrences, which is a major issue that, you know, a lot of autistic people end up with co-occurring physical health conditions, which can be a real barrier because there's actually things about autism that make it difficult to navigate the healthcare system, some additional barriers there. And so that can be a real issue for those people. And that is probably something related to whatever causes autism in the first place, usually. Although then again, there might be things like sensory discomfort associated with autism, or people not getting as much exercise because there's, you know, maybe they're bullied when they try and go and play in sports, or maybe the sensory overload of a sports thing is too aversive, and so they don't get as much physical activity, and that could contribute. So again, these are all just examples of the many ways in which you can get some very complex interactions between like being autistic, having negative experiences as a result of being autistic, having things that are sort of etiologically, neurobiologically part of being autism, but also related to some of these other things, and then having maybe things about autism that, like the rumination, exacerbate some of these other things. It becomes a really complex mess, as things often are in the real world.
Right. Well, that's what I like to hear. I like to hear a complex story rather than a neat and tidy explanation. I think reality is pretty messy and complex and chaotic, and
especially where people are involved.
Exactly. Yeah, we are maybe among the most complex creatures on the planet. Yeah, you just brought up a lot of interesting issues there that I wanted to maybe briefly touch on. Some things that came to mind for me was this interplay between biology and environment, and how it's not so straightforward as, people who have autistic, who are autistic, have come prepackaged with various behaviors of sorts, depression and anxiety, due to just the way that the brain intrinsically is. It's more subtle and nuanced than that. There's a whole developmental story we could tell there of how certain environmental things impact that brain development. The enlarging of the amygdala maybe being affected by a distressing environment, and then that just sort of exacerbates their condition. And I think it kind of ties back into this classical philosophical duality between nature and nurture, and what that implies for development, and in this case autistic individuals, and also to of the malleability of autism, along the lifespan, and how environmental events can impact development in significant ways in that respect. And also what came to mind for me too was the reality of autistic individuals having this hyperarousal, this hyperreactivity, and I'm interested in that because I'm interested in emotions and how people perceive emotions and individual differences in emotion perception. And I've done some study with Professor Tanaka. I took his course on facial recognition, and that's one of the themes we touched on was autism and face recognition, recognition of facial emotions and things like that. And that kind of ties into what you were talking about with respect to the hyperarousal. I think one of the hypotheses, I think this might be Professor Tanaka's hypothesis, is this gaze aversion hypothesis, that looking at someone in the face and in the eyes leads to hyperarousal in the amygdala, and in that the primitive brain core, and therefore that's why they have an aversive tendency to look away from people. I find that pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I do as well, and I actually co-authored like an encyclopedia entry with Jim Tanaka about exactly that issue, and it gets back again to that nature nurture thing, which, by the way, in developmental psychology we just sort of gave up. We argued about that for decades and decades and decades, got nowhere, and then decided that it was just a stupid argument and that we should accept that both of them are probably involved to some extent in everything and have complex interactions, and that's where we got neuroconstructivism, and things have been much more sensible since we stopped having that silly argument. But getting back to face processing, and there is it seems definitely some aversion to eye contact in older autistic individuals. As you say, that's been shown. You can see hyperreactivity in the brain when you're putting people in like an fMRI scanner, and you're looking at their reaction to eye contact. But interestingly, it's hard to see so much evidence of that in younger children, and partly that's just because it's harder to figure that out. You can't really ask these young children; they're like infants and toddlers, so it's harder to get them to describe what's going through their heads. It's also hard to get them to sit still in an MRI scanner because these things are noisy, and you have to sit absolutely still. So you can't really scan young kids except with a sleep scan. And if they're asleep, they can't see faces or eye contact. So you can't do that study. But with the things that we can do, it's been hard to get sort of a clear evidence that people are finding that aversive early on. And one of the hypotheses that has been advanced for that is that it's not aversive early on, but that as a result of all these negative social experiences, people start to find it aversive later on, which, it's we don't know that for sure. Again, we don't know what's going through the heads of these young people, but if that is true, that'd just be one more example of that complex nature nurture stuff at work.
Right. That's pretty interesting. I mean, I think it's a pretty open question. It's a complex issue. One way that I've been kind of trying to conceptualize it is perhaps from an evolutionary framework, and an evolutionary psychological framework specifically. I wonder if there's some kind of adaptive utility or value to having that hyperarousal in certain individuals. Is there an evolutionary account we can maybe provide of behaviors like that? It seems
possibly. Like I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Were you done?
No, that's okay. That's kind of all I had to say on that. I mean,
sure.
Insofar as hyperarousal will, maybe enhance survival in certain situations, in certain contexts. Could it not be adaptive in certain situations? And I guess this is getting back to this issue you had brought up earlier of disability and how there being a mismatch between person and environment. So maybe if there was a right match between the person and the environment, one in which you had a tendency to be hyperarousal, that would prevent you from getting bitten by a snake in the grass or something along these lines.
Or you could think of a hyperfocus maybe as being adaptive in some contexts as well, that sort of intense hyper-focused attention. And it doesn't have to just be autism specifically if we're talking about the polygenetic stuff, because it could be that these are things that were adaptive in the ancestral environment on their own. Whether or not that was the case of autism itself, I don't know. I mean, evolution is blind, it's not moral. So ultimately, I don't really care very much whether or not autism resulted in more babies in the ancestral environment. I think that that's a poor way of defining whether or not autism is a good thing in the here and the now. And I think that, we should be accepting autistic people. We should be valuing autistic people because that is a humane thing to do, period. That's why I support the neurodiversity movement. But and that being so, I don't think it's necessary that we must say that it's adaptive or not. But you're right; it could be. It could be that autism itself is adaptive because of the hyperfocus and the hyper arousal and all these things in particular environments, or it could be that some of the genetic variants associated with it are adaptive, whether that's in the context of autism or generally.
Interesting. Yeah, I think from my own point of view, I think there are some virtues to examining things from the standpoint of an evolutionary model, and thinking of things in an evolutionary psychological perspective, but it also has its limitations too. And I don't think we can explain all behavior and mental processes strictly in that sense. It also too depends on what kind of evolutionary framework we're coming from too, because it's not completely obvious to me that Darwin's story was entirely correct in all of its respects, but my own sort of philosophical tendency, I suppose, right now in my current thinking is to kind of view evolutionary development in some sense in teleological terms, as having some purpose, as having some directionality to it. It's not necessarily blind, and so I almost kind of in some sense think of this in maybe Aristotelian terms, in terms of a final cause that we're moving towards,
But I'm gonna have to push back against that, because I mean, again, evolution, all it really comes down to in the end is having more babies. So, I feel like in practice it sometimes does result in that, but it's not inherent to the mechanism, right? Like, there is no sense in which humans with our more all of our technological advancements, all of our philosophy, all of the investment and care that we put into raising our young people, hopefully, in most cases, there's no sense in which, from an evolutionary perspective, that's a better strategy than some fish that has 10 bajillion babies, most of which die, and that does not it has a miserable life afterwards for the one that does survive. I mean, so yeah, I like evolution. I feel can be teleological, but when it happens, isn't that just kind of a fluke of chance?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have an exact answer myself, but I like to dabble around, to think about things in certain ways, and
Well, I do agree. Certainly, it's a very interesting way of thinking about things. I sometimes say that between evolutionary psychology and cultural psychology, logically, you ought to be able to explain anything and everything about humans, because it's bound to be one or the other.
Right. Yeah, I know.
Or both.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of possibilities, right? I mean, the way I've kind of been thinking about it lately is like, from a human perspective, I feel like all human beings have, latent potentials that can be manifested into actualities if the environment accommodates those, the development of those abilities, and so on and so forth. And so that's more or less, a person's personal evolution kind of operating according to, say, some kind of type of blueprint. Maybe I've kind of been thinking of it like Jungian terms a lot lately, in terms of archetypes, and within every human being we have certain archetypes that can be an archetype. In this sense, I'm kind of defining as kind of patterns of thinking and feeling and behaving that are latent within us, and that upon exposure to certain influences within the environment can be activated, whether that be, certain ways of perceiving things, certain emotional responses, certain personality characteristics, and that more or less ties back into this view of the collective unconscious and how we've inherited these archetypes from our ancestors, and all of these archetypes are latent within us, just awaiting to be activated by the environment. And then when they do, we move closer towards individuation and actualizing our potentials, because we are allowing these archetypes to express themselves in healthy ways. So I don't know if this aligns at all with any of your thinking on these things. But
I mean, this may be one of those cases where we might need to enter into a longer dialogue, because I feel like some of the terms you're probably understanding them in a way that makes sense, but that doesn't make sense to me. There's probably some incommensurability here. So if we were to have a longer conversation, maybe we'd be able to figure out where it is that we agree and disagree. As it is, I tend to be fairly, I guess, materialistic in my thinking sometimes, and I'm having trouble sort of operationalizing some of the things that you're saying.
Sure.
But I expect that if we had a longer conversation, we'd probably be able to figure out some areas of agreement and consensus.
Sure. Well, we can maybe bookmark that topic and maybe return to it for a future conversation if you're open to it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm always interested in interesting conversations. Not that I really know anything about Jungian archetypes, but it would be, maybe then, you could be the expert on the content area, and I could be the non-expert, whatever that word is. There's not a lot of respectful words for non-expert, are there?
Layman.
Yeah, but is that a respectful word? I guess it's fine.
Well, I think I know myself. I tend to take a Socratic stance to approaching my understanding of things, and which means for me, in some sense, always recognizing my limitations to knowledge and my own ignorance. And I think there's a certain virtue in admitting your ignorance about certain things. I certainly don't know nearly as much as you about which your area of research interest is. Maybe I know a few things about philosophy that you don't necessarily know, and I think that's the beauty of having open-ended conversations like this. Where
Absolutely.
we can try to get to some commensurability, as far as that's possible, and some get to some new insights. It's about exploration and discovery and.
Indeed, yes. Well said.
Yeah. So I guess we've covered most of the main questions that I wanted to go over. You've addressed them in pretty thorough detail. There's room for some elaborations, I suppose. I guess one of the questions I'm curious about is what kind of interventions are typically used when working with somebody with autism.
Well, that depends, and that's also hugely controversial for the. It depends on what individual we're talking about. Are they young? Are they like a preschool age child? Are they an adult? Are they a school age adolescent? Are they a transition age adolescent? And that's just one dimension of age. Then there's the question of, well, what sorts of co-occurring conditions or disabilities might they have, getting back to an earlier question of yours, because very often if there is a co-occurring disability or condition, sometimes it makes more sense to intervene on that rather than trying to do anything about the autism itself or the barriers that accompany it, at least at first. Then there's going to be questions about, like, well, what about, their language ability? Where would they score on an IQ test, which, by the way, is its own other question, because not all the IQ tests get the same results. But, accepting that IQ is imperfect, especially as measured in autism, where approximately would they score on an IQ test? All these factors are going to be relevant here. I could talk, for example, about early intervention. I mentioned earlier that there's sort of often an atypical experience early in life as a result of being autistic. You're attending to the world in a different way. You're interacting with the world in a different way, and maybe for some people that could result in them missing opportunities for development because people around them are expecting a neurotypical child, and they're not quite sure what the best way to interact with the autistic child that they actually got might be. And that is, it's a tricky area, because traditionally the way that those early interventions were done was not very good, basically. People were taking a very directive, very compliance-oriented approach, very authoritarian approach, and sort of sitting down these young, like 2-3-year-old children at a table and making them do drills. And if they don't do the drills properly, you punish them originally, was how it works. And if they do it well, then you reward them, like you give candy, like you're training a dog or something. For multitude of reasons, autistic people hate this kind of intervention by and large, or at least autistic people in the neurodiversity advocacy movement do. There's, the compliance-oriented aspect, which people don't like in and of itself. We should not be treating 2- and 3-year-olds in this way. It's, stressful, potentially traumatic, could, train people to be compliant and obedient, which could really hurt their self-determination and make them more vulnerable. Then there's the question of, well, you're kind of training them to, not be autistic. You're kind of training them to hide their autism, and that could not actually be the way to go here. That could just be sort of training people to hide their difficulties, and to, like, for example, if they really want to stim as a self-regulatory strategy, that's again those sort of repetitive motor movements. That's not harming anybody. And if they're having to not do that, maybe that is harming them now. And then, of course, like if you're using aversives, which by and large isn't done today, although there are some really unfortunate exceptions, like this one place called the Judge Cronenberg Center, which is, by and large, the aversives aren't done today, but obviously that was problematic. And even just withholding rewards, like even withholding affection until people do the things that you want them to do, there's some definite ethical issues there. I mean, these are young children, withholding affection until they meet some standard as to what you think is proper, which may not be the right standard of proper to begin with anyway. That there's some issues there. So people are, I would like to think, starting to move away from that. There's unfortunately a lot of people who still cling to outdated viewpoints on this issue. But people are starting to move away from these more discrete trial compliance-oriented variants of what's called ABA intervention, which is applied behavior analysis, which is very much a trigger word in the community. People in the community really hate the word ABA. People, I think, are starting to shift away from these and towards more naturalistic interventions that are, trying to use what people themselves, these young people themselves, are interested in order to build interactions and create some of those opportunities that you can learn from other people, and get those opportunities to learn skills that you might otherwise miss out on. It's not done perfectly yet, but I think people are getting better at it. I think I would like to think that there's a decent number of people who are interested in learning from the autistic community and moving past the mistakes with the older discrete trial stuff. There are certainly some naturalistic developmental variants of ABA itself that I think are much better if still imperfect. I've done some collaborative research with people like Rachel Schuck and Caitlin Penner from UC Santa Barbara. They've done some really interesting work getting autistic people's perspectives on how to further improve those naturalistic developmental interventions. There's also developmental without the naturalistic behavioral stuff interventions, which are honestly not that different. So let's not even bother explaining the differences. But basically, it's a huge debate in the community. People really hate ABA, by which I think they mean those traditional discrete trial variants. And I hope that we can move past it. But that although that's one area of autism intervention, I'm going to now pivot to a whoppingly different area, which is employment. So now instead of a 2 or 3 year old child sitting in front of us, we now have, say, a 16-year-old or a 25-year-old or a 55-year-old who wants a job. And how do we go about that? Well, it's a massively different question, isn't it? And so there is unfortunately a traditional approach there that's like, okay, well, let's go and train job skills to the autistic person. Let's give them some vocational training. But that's just not all that effective, because a lot of the issues that we're seeing here are actually from the side of the employer, that the employer is discriminating against autistic people because they're expecting a certain type of person to come up in their job interview. And some autistic people are fairly good at copying neurotypical social mannerisms and camouflaging and hiding autism, although that may come with a mental health cost. Some autistic people are not, and there can be subtle quirks. There's research by people like Noah Sasson and Ruth Grossman and others that show that, within seconds of seeing a video clip of an autistic person or even a still image, people can judge them very negatively. So obviously that's going to hurt people in a job interview if there's this very subtle, very automatic negative bias just driven by some quirk in the social style of the autistic person. Incidentally, transcripts of what the autistic people said was not rated more negatively. It was just the style, not the substance. And that's just one example of the many ways in which a neurotypical employer who just doesn't really get autism can really hurt the autistic person and their chances there. So an intervention that's trying to train job skills to the autistic person can sometimes just really be missing the point, because the point is not that the autistic person isn't skilled, it's that they don't have an opportunity to develop their employment skills in an actual job setting because nobody will hire them, or they get hired and then fired again because they don't fit in socially or they don't behave appropriately at social events that they're expected to attend and that sort of thing. So a lot of the most effective employment interventions will actually work with the employer to create job opportunities for neurodivergent folks. So you could see a job coach coming in and working with the neurotypical employer to set up an opportunity, or there might be a company that has a program for hiring autistic and neurodivergent people. And a lot of that came out of big tech companies because there's stereotypes about autistic people doing well in those jobs. Of course, we're very diverse. And I'm encouraged by some signs that there's interest in moving that beyond sort of the big tech companies and opening it up more generally. Hopefully that will be the case because we are a super diverse population. But yeah, so those are two really different from each other. And of course, you could see so many other things as well, like how do you do mental health support for autistic people, because mental health supports for neurotypical people do not work very well when they're applied to autism. What about mental health supports for autistic people who also have co-occurring intellectual disabilities? There's so many things I could talk about here if we had like 10 hours for me to ramble.
Right. Yeah, I think we're only scratching the surface here. It's very there's a lot of depth to this topic for sure, and we could go pretty deep on this, I'm sure. But I guess we have some limits with our time, and we can maybe kind of draw things to summation. But maybe let me just briefly get back to some of the things you said there, which I thought were interesting. So one was this. One was kind of counter to my own intuitions, which is typically, at least in the textbooks, researchers are always talking about how ABA and behavioral interventions are among the most effective interventions for autism. So when you had talked about how there's this dislike for the way that I kind of was understanding what you were saying was this sort of this dislike for methods of positive reinforcement and things like that.
Yeah, it's complicated. There's a lot of terminology stuff in. Sorry, I was just going to say it's complicated because there's a lot of terminology stuff there. I actually have one blog post on this that is just trying to, because this is probably another area where there's some incommensurability with the terminology. So autistic people in the community object to ABA, but I'm not quite sure that autistic people in the community use the term ABA in exactly the same way that clinicians do. But certainly everybody in the community hates discrete trial training and possibly other kinds of ABA as well. So discrete trial training, again, that very compliance-oriented, very explicit reward-oriented approach. Sorry to interrupt there. I just wanted to clarify that.
Oh, yeah, no, it's good to clarify. I do think there are limitations due to the behavioral approach. And I mean, coming from my own sense, what I think a good theoretical orientation is right now I've been kind of tending to gravitate toward a lot of humanistic school of thinking, and a lot of what you had mentioned about with naturalistic interventions had reminded me a little bit of the humanistic approach, insofar as we don't want to view someone who has autism as being inherently defective.
No.
We want to be hold them in with unconditional positive regard. We want to
Right.
we want to create a climate of acceptance.
We do.
And if you can do that, it's not so much what you do, but it's at least overtly. But if you can create that atmosphere in which the person can trust the wisdom of their organism, kind of to use Roger's terms, that person can figure things out on their own, just on the basis of going on like what feels right for that person.
Yeah. I think that we need to move in that sort of direction. You're absolutely right. I mean, these ideas of treating autism as deficit, they just result in so much harm, people doubting themselves, feeling miserable for no good reason, expectation effects. If you say it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That doesn't mean that there aren't real challenges and real barriers that people are facing. That doesn't mean there's not real disability that people are facing. Obviously there is. And that's partly related to the individual and partly related to the environment. It's that fit, that mismatch, as we were saying before. But you're absolutely right there that there's so much that we could learn from a lot of these other approaches, and I think Rogers and humanistic approaches are part of that, yeah, we need to bring that in, and that is exactly the sort of thing that neurodiversity advocates want, that people need to be accepted unconditionally as they are. And we need to figure out if there is a need to learn useful coping skills for navigating the neurotypical world and learning useful skills that will serve people well and allow them to do things they otherwise might have struggled with. We need to figure out how to do that without compromising that unconditional acceptance. Yeah, so that was a great point that you made there.
Yeah, well, I thought, it makes sense for me, when I think about it in those terms. And I know from my own personal experience, I've dabbled around, doing my own self-directed psychotherapy and self-care. I've tried a lot of the different, tried to put on a lot of different hats: my behaviorist hat, my humanistic hat, my cognitive behavioral hat, and the humanistic approach, has always seemed to work well for me, and that's why I think I gravitate towards it. And I don't necessarily feel like, if I encounter someone who judges me in a negative light, I don't necessarily see that necessarily as a reflection of me per se. It's just not the environment being favorable toward my own development. And if I can take a approach, regardless of the feedbacks that I get from others, positive or negative, if I can kind of trust myself, if I can trust my organism, in its wisdom, I think all naturally develop along healthy lines. And I think what's personal for me can maybe be universal in that regard. And I think too, a lot of what comes into that is, bringing this back to philosophy is being truthful to yourself, and that kind of creates the conditions for growth and for change. Insofar as you can be truthful, and you can be, like Roger talks about it in terms of like openness to experience. Like that was kind of the big virtue that he talked about, or the trait that kind of made healthy personality growth and development possible, was being open to experience, being open to change. For him, that means like not distorting, the information that's coming in, but just to kind of represent it the way it is, and allowing it to be transparent to you, because we get into a lot of trouble when we distort. And I think insofar as we can be open to our experience, we can let those defensive barriers down, which often lead to that distortion, and then that, seeing things in a clearer light, in a more truthful light, we can better adapt to our circumstances and our situation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, people say that autistic people aren't open to experience, and that we aren't flexible, and all of that, but I think that's a reaction to being in a world where we have a lot of negative experiences, when we aren't exercising our self-determination, and when we are pushed into these things by other people, and so you sort of get people then into a defensive reaction. So if you can create a world where people have some more of that autonomy, and they can follow what works best for them, I think people would be open very much to experience in that sense, and also it's I think there's a lot of stereotypes about autistic people being closed-minded, and things that unfortunately have a lot more to do in many cases with a defensive reaction to the same sorts of behaviors coming from people around the autistic people, usually neurotypical people who are in positions of power, and they're using those positions of power to unfortunate, damaging sorts of effects. But if you had people following a more accepting approach, respecting people's self-determination, and as you say, that unconditional acceptance, I hope that a lot of that could be different.
Right. Well, it's an admirable ideal to shoot for, and I think both neurotypical and autistic people could benefit from that kind of approach to orienting their lives.
Yeah, I agree.
So I guess we're getting pretty close to our time. Did you want to chime in at all, Ryan? Do you have any other things you wanted to get in there before we adjourn for the night?
I think that's good for this time. I do have some maybe larger questions that if Patrick's open to meeting again, that we can get into. I think he mentioned some of them as well that we'd bookmark for later. So as for today, I'm more than satisfied. I've learned a lot. If anything today, showed me, how much that I did know, or that I thought I knew about autism. It was very surface level, and it's interesting because of my field of work that I do work with individuals, youth with autism. So this has been really, really enlightening, and I hope useful in my profession moving forward, just at least to keep in mind as sort of an attitude going forward, working with the individuals that I work with. So.
Well, thank you. I really I'm glad that you're finding my rambles to be informative, but I think that comes down to not just what I'm saying, but sort of the collective wisdom and knowledge of the autistic community. As we were saying earlier, that as you get people together. One of the useful things about the construct of autism is that you have had people sort of pooling their wisdom and developing these concepts so that I can express them here and now.
I think all this underscores the importance of having dialogue and discussion and open conversations and listening conversations like the one we had tonight. I would have to second what Brian said. I think this has been an immensely interesting and useful conversation and a fruitful conversation. It's opened my mind up to the different subtleties and nuances of autism that I didn't know before we had our conversation. So I appreciate those insights. And maybe just before we close, I'll just briefly summarize some of the things we covered. So we sort of hit home on the question of what is autism. We talked about some of the differences between the perceived differences between Asperger's syndrome and autism. We hit on the biopsychosocial factors for understanding autism. We looked at some of the comorbidities and closed things off with discussion of interventions, plus everything in between, some fruitful digressions and tangents down some rabbit holes, which I think led to some interesting discoveries and some insights. So that's kind of the conversation in a nutshell. Unless there's anything else you guys want to add in parting, I'm happy to bring things to a close for the night.
I don't think I have anything to add, but yeah, I had fun doing a lot of talking. Hopefully sometime I'm interested in doing some listening as well. But thank you. This has been fun.
Excellent. Well, we will definitely be in touch then, and hopefully we can have another interesting exploratory conversation on whatever that may be. So, well, thanks for tuning in, everybody, and catch us next time.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, thanks, guys.